The frequency of a human lie is surprisingly low. When you spend your days staring at audio waveforms in a soundproof basement studio in downtown Chicago, you start to notice things normal people miss: a sudden drop in pitch, a microsecond hesitation before a hard consonant, a subtle intake of breath that doesn't match the rhythm of natural speech. "I don't have much time left, Silas," the old man said, his voice trembling through the cheap condenser microphone. Silas sat at his mixing console, his fingers resting lightly on the physical faders. He didn't look at the man sitting on the stool across the glass pane. Instead, his eyes were locked on the digital monitor. On the screen, the waveform of his father's voice looked jagged, unnatural, and uneven. "The doctors in Seattle gave me 6 months," Donald continued, leaning heavily onto his cane. His knuckles were white, his face pale and weathered from what looked like decades of hard living. "Stage 4. It's in the lungs, kid. I didn't come here asking for a handout. I couldn't die knowing you still hated me." Silas adjusted his headphones. He was 32 years old, an audio engineer who made his living cleaning up the background noise of other people's messy lives. Podcasts, indie films, corporate voiceovers. He knew how to spot a fake. But looking at the frail, shivering 60-year-old man who had walked out on him when he was just a boy, Silas felt a dangerous warmth blooming in his chest. It was guilt. 12 years, Donald," Silas said, his voice flat, bypassing the microphone and speaking directly through the open studio door. 12 years of radio silence, and you just show up at my workplace because your cells are misbehaving?" "I was a coward," Donald whispered. The waveform on the monitor spiked sharply, a sudden, genuine burst of emotion, or at least a very good imitation of one. "But I'm here now, please." Silas closed his eyes, inhaling the stale, carpet-scented air of the studio. Every rational instinct told him to point to the exit, but a darker, more fragile part of him wanted the closure he had been denied for over a decade. He pushed the fader down, silencing the room. Before we dive deeper into the dark, twisted web Silas was about to pull himself into, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this auditory puzzle unravels. Silas finally stood up, grabbing his leather jacket from the back of his chair. "My apartment has a couch. It's small, it's noisy, and it's all you're getting. Let's go." As they stepped out of the soundproof sanctuary of the studio and into the brisk, damp Chicago air, Silas was completely consumed by the emotional weight of his father's return. Because of that, he completely failed to notice the matte black SUV parked directly across the street, its tinted windows rolled up tight, its engine idling with a low, menacing purr that vibrated right through the soles of his shoes. Silas had no idea that by opening his door to a dying man, he had just signed away the safety of his own life. The apartment was a fourth-floor walk-up in Logan Square, filled with the hum of the Blue Line train in the distance and the constant smell of roasted coffee from the cafe downstairs. Silas lived a life of strict routine, a routine that was thoroughly shattered within 48 hours of Donald's arrival. By Thursday evening, the apartment felt smaller than ever. Silas's girlfriend, Elena, stood by the kitchen counter, aggressively chopping garlic for a pasta dish. At 29, Elena was a rising star at a prominent civil rights law firm downtown. She possessed a brilliant, analytical mind and a gaze that could make a seasoned prosecutor sweat under pressure. Right now, that gaze was directed entirely at Silas. "He's hiding something, Si," Elena whispered, her knife hitting the wooden cutting board with a rhythmic, sharp thwack. "I've cross-referenced his medical claims. He says he was treated at Harborview Medical in Seattle. But when I dropped a casual question about the oncology ward's layout during breakfast, he got the floor numbers completely wrong. A real cancer patient knows exactly where they receive their chemo." "He's old, Elena. He's confused," Silas argued, though his mind flashed back to the jagged waveforms on his studio monitor. "He's not confused," Elena countered, pointing the knife at him for emphasis. "He's cautious. Have you seen his hands? He claims he has severe neuropathy from the treatments, but yesterday I watched him catch a falling glass of water out of midair with the reflexes of a 20-year-old athlete. Your father isn't dying, Silas. He's running." Before Silas could respond, the heavy footsteps of his next-door neighbor, a retired city transit worker named Al, echoed in the hallway. Al was a man who knew the schedule of everyone on the block. He knocked briefly and pushed the door open, holding a misdelivered package for Silas. "Hey, Silas," Al said, his booming voice filling the small kitchen. "You got some strange friends hanging around the block lately. Some woman in a sharp gray suit was asking me if the old man with the limp was staying in 4B. Had a real cold vibe to her. Thought you ought to know." Silas felt a cold drop of sweat trace down his spine. Did she give a name? No, Al said, shaking his head. But she had a tattoo of a black scorpion on the side of her neck, not exactly the neighborhood welcoming committee. The anxiety followed Silas to work the next morning. He sat at his mixing desk, unable to focus on the audio tracks for a true crime podcast he was supposed to be editing. His assistant and closest friend, Malik, a 24-year-old digital prodigy who spent his free time archiving old internet lore, noticed Silas's distraction immediately. "You look like trash, man," Malik said, spinning around in his ergonomic chair. "Is the old man giving you ghosts?" "It's not just him," Silas sighed, rubbing his temples. "Elena thinks he's faking the illness. And some strange woman was asking the neighbors about him." Malik's eyes lit up with curiosity. "You know, when you told me his full name was Donald Vance, I did a little deep web scraping on the old family tree. Did you know your dad used to be a high-level network administrator for a Swiss private bank back in the early 2010s? Silas frowned. "He told me he was a salesman." "Yeah, well, he sold something, all right," Malik said, typing furiously on his mechanical keyboard. "Look at this. In 2016, a massive, untraceable hack hit a major cryptocurrency exchange called CoinVault. Over $45 million in Bitcoin vanished overnight. The keys were pulled from the inside using a physical hardware ledger. One of the prime suspects who disappeared right before the feds raided the place? A guy matching your dad's description using an alias." Silas stared at Malik's screen. His breath caught in his throat. The piece of information felt too large, too heavy to process. It was absurd. His father was an old man who slept on his couch and complained about his joints. He couldn't be an international cyber fugitive. That night, Silas decided to find out for himself. He waited until 3 a.m. The apartment was completely dark, save for the ambient orange glow of the streetlights bleeding through the blinds. Donald was asleep on the sofa, his chest rising and falling in a slow, deep rhythm. Silas crept into the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He approached Donald's battered leather duffel bag resting near the television stand. Silas unzipped it slowly, the metal teeth of the zipper making a sickeningly loud sound in the dead silence of the night. Inside were just ordinary clothes, some toiletries, and a pill bottle. Silas picked up the bottle. The label was scratched off. Suddenly, a cold, hard grip clamped down around Silas's wrist with terrifying, bone-crushing force. Silas gasped, looking up into the darkness. Donald's eyes were wide open, completely alert, shining with a sharp, lethal intelligence that had absolutely nothing to do with a dying man. "You shouldn't be digging in there, son," Donald whispered, his voice dangerously smooth, completely devoid of the gravelly tremor he had used in the studio. Silas tried to pull his wrist away, but his father's grip was like a steel vice. In that horrifying moment of clarity, Silas realized Elena was right. The man on his couch wasn't a victim of terminal illness. He was a master actor. But the terror truly settled in when Silas looked past his father's shoulder and saw the small, blinking red light of a high-tech tracking device hidden inside the lining of the duffel bag, a device that had just begun to beep at double its normal speed. "Sit down, Silas," Donald said, releasing his grip and sitting up on the edge of the couch. The frail posture was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, calculating stance of a man who spent his life looking over his shoulder. Silas stumbled backward, rubbing his bruised wrist. "Who are you? And don't give me that dying father garbage. Tell me the truth." Donald let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbing his face with his hands. "The cancer is fake. I needed a story that would make you soft enough to let me in. But the danger? That is entirely real. 10 years ago, I helped a very powerful, very dangerous group of people move $45 million out of an exchange. I was supposed to launder it through a series of cold storage wallets and hand over the private keys. But I realized the moment I handed them over, I was a dead man." "So you stole it," Silas said, the reality of the situation settling over him like a cold shroud. "I secured my retirement," Donald corrected him coldly. "But 3 weeks ago, my location in Seattle was compromised. The woman hunting me is named Valeria. She's a fixer for the syndicate I robbed. She doesn't stop, Silas. She's tracked me across 3 continents. I came here because I thought the last place she would look for a rogue cyber thief would be in the apartment of a low-profile audio engineer in Chicago." "You brought a target to my home?" Silas yelled, his voice rising in panic. "You put Elena in danger? You put my life on the line for a payday?" "I didn't have a choice," Donald snapped back. "And it's not a payday anymore. It's survival. The keys to the wallet are locked inside an encrypted partition on a custom drive. But I made a mistake, Silas. 2 days ago, when I used your home network to check the block confirmation heights, I had to bypass your local router firewall. I didn't think anyone was watching your specific IP address. Silas felt the air leave his lungs. He remembered the matte black SUV. He remembered Al's warning about the woman with the scorpion tattoo. They tracked the data packet, Silas whispered. Yes, Donald said quietly. They know exactly where I am now. And because I'm here with you, they think we're partners. They think you're the one holding the backup keys. The next morning, the pressure cooker exploded. Silas tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, heading to the studio early to figure out an escape plan with Elena. But when he walked into the editing bay, the smell of expensive, metallic perfume hit his nose before he even saw her. Sitting in his rolling chair, her boots resting casually on the expensive mixing console, was a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, exposing a vivid, pitch-black tattoo of a scorpion creeping up the left side of her neck. Valeria. Standing beside her were two massive men in heavy jackets, their hands tucked significantly inside their pockets. Malik was cornered in the back of the room, his face pale, his hands raised in the air. "Silas," Valeria said, her voice smooth, sounding like silk sliding over a blade. "I've been listening to some of your audio work. You have an incredible ear for detail. It's a shame your father doesn't share your respect for boundaries." "I don't know where he is," Silas said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "He left this morning." Valeria laughed, a short, humorless sound. She stood up, walking slowly toward Silas. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing against the collar of his jacket. "Let's not play these childish games. Donald Vance has been running for a decade. He's tired. You're tired. We know he moved a massive data load through your home IP address 48 hours ago. We know he's transferring the funds. I don't care about your family drama, Silas. I just want the digital ledger. Give it to me, and you and your lovely girlfriend can keep playing house." "I don't have it," Silas insisted. Valeria's smile vanished, her eyes turning into chips of ice. She leaned in close, her breath warm against his ear. "You have until midnight tonight to bring your father and the ledger to the abandoned rail yard on 18th Street. If you aren't there, or if the feds show up, I won't just kill you, Silas. I'll make sure Elena spends the rest of her short life wishing she had never met you. Do you understand?" She signaled her men, and within seconds, they vanished down the hallway, leaving Silas and a trembling Malik alone in the silent, suffocating studio. Silas knew he couldn't go to the police. The syndicate had eyes everywhere, and Donald's criminal past meant they would all end up in a federal holding cell before the day was out. He needed help from someone who operated in the gray areas of the law. He called Elena, explaining the situation in frantic, clipped sentences. "We need security, Elena. Real security." "Who do we know?" "My brother," Elena said immediately, her voice sharp with fear but steady with legal resolve. "Gavin. He's an ex-military contractor who runs a private security firm out in the suburbs. He has the hardware, he has the men, and he owes me a massive favor. Meet me at the apartment. We'll get your father and get out of the city." An hour later, Silas, Elena, and Donald were gathered in the living room, waiting for Gavin to arrive. Donald looked remarkably calm, sitting on the sofa with a small silver USB drive resting between his fingers. "This is it," Donald said, holding up the drive. "The 45 million. It's all right here. If your brother can get us across the border to Canada, I can liquidate enough of it to ensure we all disappear comfortably." "I don't want your stolen blood money, Donald," Silas said through gritted teeth. "I just want to stay alive." The door to the apartment suddenly burst open, and Gavin stepped inside. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, wearing a tactical jacket, his eyes scanning the room with military precision. Two of his heavily armed operatives stood guard in the hallway. "We need to move now," Gavin said, his voice commanding. "My guys spotted 2 scout cars at the end of the block. Valeria is closing the perimeter early. Give me the drive, Donald. I'll secure it in our armored transport vehicle while we get you down the back fire escape." Donald hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes tracking Gavin's movements. But with the sound of screeching tires echoing from the street below, he handed the silver drive over to the security team leader. They hurried down the dark, narrow fire escape, the freezing Chicago wind whipping against their faces. Gavin led the way, his hand resting on his sidearm. They reached the alleyway, where a large, black transport van was idling with its side door open. Silas helped Elena into the back of the van, turning around to assist his father. But as Donald stepped toward the vehicle, Gavin suddenly spun around, drawing his weapon and aiming it directly at Donald's chest. "Whoa, whoa! Gavin, what are you doing?" Silas screamed, stepping between them. Gavin didn't lower the weapon. A cold, arrogant smirk spread across his face. "Sorry, Silas, and sorry, little sister, but private security doesn't pay nearly as well as $45 million in untraceable cryptocurrency. Valeria offered me a 10% finder's fee just to bring her the old man. But now that I have the drive myself, I think I'll keep the whole damn pie." Silas stared at his own brother-in-law in absolute horror. In their desperate bid to find protection, they had walked straight into a trap sprung by their own blood. Gavin raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, ready to eliminate the only witnesses to his ultimate betrayal. "Gavin, please," Elena cried out from inside the van, her hands shaking as she reached out for her brother. "You can't do this! We're family!" "Family doesn't pay the mortgages on 3 different field offices, Elle," Gavin said, his voice completely cold. "Step back." But before Gavin could pull the trigger, Donald did something entirely unexpected. He didn't run, and he didn't beg. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black smartphone, tapping the screen once. A loud, piercing electronic screech echoed from Gavin's pocket. Gavin flinched, his eyes darting down. The silver USB drive he had tucked into his tactical vest was glowing with a brilliant, intense blue light. A strange, acrid smell of burning plastic and ozone filled the damp alleyway air. "What did you do?" Gavin yelled, dropping his gun slightly as he reached into his vest to pull out the scorching hot drive. It was so hot it blistered his fingers, forcing him to drop it onto the wet asphalt. "Did you really think a high-level network administrator wouldn't recognize a thermal kill modification?" Donald said, a grim smile touching his lips. "That drive isn't a ledger, Gavin. It's a hardware trap. The second you walked into my son's apartment, I noticed your watch. A customized Breitling Military Edition with a specific satellite comms tracking bezel, the exact same model the syndicate issued to its high-level contractors last year. You didn't come here to save us. You were tracking us the whole time." Silas looked down at the asphalt. The silver drive was completely melting, its internal circuits frying into useless black sludge right before their eyes. "You ruined it!" Gavin roared, his face contorting with absolute rage. He raised his weapon again, aiming directly at Donald's head. "If I can't have the coins, Valeria will still pay millions for your corpse." Bang! The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed brick alleyway. But it didn't come from Gavin's weapon. Gavin stiffened, his eyes widening in shock as a clean, small hole appeared in the center of his tactical vest. He stumbled backward, dropping his gun, before collapsing heavily against the side of the van. Silas spun around. Standing at the mouth of the alleyway was Valeria, holding a suppressed pistol, her face completely expressionless. Behind her stood 4 of her heavily armed enforcers. "Thank you for doing the heavy lifting, Gavin," Valeria said smoothly, stepping over his motionless body. She looked down at the smoking, melted ruin of the USB drive on the ground, and her expression instantly hardened into something demonic. "You old fool! You destroyed the ledger?" "I destroyed that ledger," Donald said, stepping forward, shield positioning Silas behind him. "The real keys are safely stored in a cloud partition that requires a dual authorization biometric scan. 1 from me and 1 from my son. If you kill either of us, the funds are locked forever in a dead man's digital vault." Valeria stared at him, her jaw tight, calculating the risk. She knew Donald was a master liar, but she couldn't risk $45 million on a bluff. "Load them into the cars," Valeria ordered her men. "We'll find out how long their resolve lasts under a blowtorch." Before her enforcers could grab Silas, a massive crash shattered the night. A large yellow city maintenance truck rammed straight into the back of Valeria's lead scout car at the end of the alley. Out of the driver's side jumped Al, Silas's retired transit neighbor, holding a heavy tire iron, accompanied by Malik, who was wildly filming the entire encounter on a high-definition phone while blaring a loud, synthesized police siren through a portable Bluetooth speaker system. "Hey, get away from my neighbors!" Al bellowed, swinging the tire iron with surprising strength, catching one of Valeria's enforcers square in the chest. The sudden, chaotic distraction threw the alleyway into pure madness. "Silas, run!" Donald shouted, grabbing his son's arm and shoving him toward the back fire escape stairs of the adjacent building. Valeria recovered instantly, raising her weapon and firing a rapid succession of shots. One of the bullets struck Donald squarely in the shoulder. He groaned, stumbling forward, but kept pushing Silas up the metal steps. Silas grabbed his father, hoisting the older man's weight over his shoulder as they scrambled up the metal grid stairs, while Elena managed to slip away into the shadows of the basement entryway below. They ran through the maze of the old brick building, bursting out onto the rooftop overlooking the sprawling, neon-lit Chicago skyline. The cold wind howled around them. Donald collapsed against a large brick ventilation shaft, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face completely pale. "This is it, Silas," Donald gasped, his voice rattling in his chest. This time, it wasn't an act. The blood pooling through his fingers was real. "I can't go any further." "No, Dad, stay with me," Silas yelled, ripping off his leather jacket to press it against the wound. "We can make it. Al created a diversion. The cops are coming." "Listen to me," Donald whispered, his grip tightening on Silas's sleeve. "I lied about the cancer. I lied about a lot of things. But I never stopped looking for you. I kept the money because I wanted to leave you something. Something that would mean you'd never have to struggle in a dark basement room for the rest of your life." Footsteps echoed from the rooftop door. Valeria stepped out into the cold night air, her hair whipping wildly around her face, her gun aimed directly at Silas's chest. "End of the line, boys," Valeria said, her voice dripping with venom. "Give me the access phrase for the biometric cloud vault, Silas, or watch your father bleed out before I send you over the edge of this roof." Silas looked at his father, then up at Valeria. He felt a strange, cold calm settle over him. He was an audio engineer. He spent his life listening to hidden details, and right now, he heard something very specific. He heard the faint, distinct click of an open audio channel coming from the small lapel microphone hidden on Valeria's collar, the exact same high-end spy gear Malik used for his investigative podcasts. Silas smiled, a slow, defiant expression. "You think you've won, Valeria? You think you're the only one who knows how to record a conversation?" Valeria frowned, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" "Before I left my studio this morning," Silas said, standing up slowly, his hands held out to his sides, "I didn't just talk to you. I left the master recording deck running on an open loop. And when you threatened my life, and when you admitted to tracking my father across 3 continents for stolen cryptocurrency, you did it directly in front of my high-sensitivity directional microphones." Valeria laughed coldly. "So what? A recording in an empty studio doesn't save you now." "It does when it's being streamed live," a new voice called out. From the shadows of the rooftop stairwell, Malik stepped out, holding his laptop high in the air. On the screen, a massive, rapidly updating feed showed a live stream broadcast with over 50,000 active viewers. "Say hello to the internet, Valeria," Malik said with a grin, "and say hello to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cybercrimes Division. I routed the studio's live audio feed directly into their tip-line portal 5 minutes ago. They've been listening to every single word you've said since you stepped into the alley." Right on cue, the distant, unmistakable wail of dozens of real police sirens began to echo from the streets below. Spotlights from a police helicopter suddenly cut through the night sky, illuminating the rooftop in a blinding, brilliant white glare. "Drop your weapon! Federal agents!" a voice boomed from the helicopter's megaphone. Valeria looked up at the sky, her face twisting into absolute fury. She realized she had been completely outplayed, not by federal agents or rival syndicates, but by a couple of audio nerds and a laptop. She dropped her weapon onto the gravel rooftop, raising her hands in the air as tactical officers began flooding the roof from the fire escapes. Medical personnel rushed to Donald's side, immediately putting him on a gurney. Silas walked alongside them, holding his father's cold hand as they wheeled him toward the service elevator. "You did good, kid," Donald whispered, a faint, genuine smile on his face, as the elevator doors closed. 3 weeks later, the dust had finally settled. Gavin was in a secure medical wing at the county jail, awaiting a trial for corporate espionage and attempted murder. Valeria and her entire syndicate ring had been dismantled by a massive federal sweep, completely exposed by the audio recordings Silas had captured. Silas sat in a quiet, sunlit coffee shop in a different part of town. Elena sat across from him, sipping her tea, her face finally free of the intense tension that had consumed her for weeks. Donald was recovering in a secure federal witness protection hospital, having traded his knowledge of the crypto network for a completely clean slate and a commuted sentence. "So," Elena said, looking at Silas carefully, "it's finally over. Your dad is safe. The syndicate is gone. We can go back to our normal, quiet lives. Yeah, Silas said, looking down at his coffee. Normal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, broken silver wristwatch. The one item the feds had allowed him to keep from his father's personal belongings before Donald was moved into witness protection. It was a cheap, battered piece of metal, completely worthless on the surface. But Silas was an audio engineer. He noticed the tiny details. When he turned the watch over, he noticed the small, physical crown piece on the side didn't turn smoothly. It had a tiny, mechanical resistance to it. Silas pressed the crown inward, expecting the hands to move. Instead, a small, microscopic click echoed from the casing. The back cover of the watch popped open by a fraction of a millimeter. Silas carefully pried the metal plate away. Tucked perfectly inside the hollowed-out mechanical movement of the watch wasn't a battery or a gear. It was a single, ultra-thin, custom-made micro SD card wrapped in protective plastic. Silas felt his breath catch in his throat. He looked up at Elena, who was watching him with a raised eyebrow. Without a word, Silas pulled out his phone, plugged in a portable card reader, and slid the microscopic card into the slot. A single, encrypted video file appeared on his screen. He tapped it, putting on his headphones. On the screen, Donald appeared, sitting in a bright tropical room filled with sunlight and the distant sound of ocean waves. He looked completely healthy, perfectly dressed, and completely content. "Hey, Silas!" Donald's voice said through the headphones, perfectly clear, perfectly balanced. "If you're watching this, it means the plan worked. Valeria is locked away, the feds think I'm a broken old man in a hospital, and the syndicate thinks the money is gone forever." Donald leaned closer to the camera, a brilliant, proud smile spreading across his face. "I told you I set up a dual authorization biometric cloud vault, Silas. What I didn't tell Valeria was that the secondary biometric scan isn't a fingerprint or an eye scan. It's an auditory key. It's the sound of your voice, recorded from that very first night in your studio, saying the word Donald. The ledger on this card contains the remaining $30 million. It's completely untraceable, completely clean, and it's all yours. Consider it your inheritance for being the only person who actually listened to me." The video cut to black. Silas sat in the quiet coffee shop, the headphones still resting on his ears. He looked out the window at the bustling Chicago street, then down at the microscopic card, holding a fortune that could change his life forever. He looked at Elena, smiled quietly, and slid the watch back into his pocket. The frequency of his life had just changed completely, and for the first time in his life, Silas liked exactly how it sounded.